Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our clients, associates, and friends around the world. And welcome to another Interfor Academy webinar. I'm very excited to introduce the speakers today as we are doing things a little bit differently than we normally do. As many of you know, Jeremy Hurewitz, the head of Interfor Academy, typically hosts our webinars and interviews our guests. However, today the table will be turned and Jeremy will be the one being interviewed by our very, very good friend, Kate Kalmykov, a partner at Greenberg Traurig, who is currently co-chairs their global immigration and compliance practice and is a tremendously talented and connected attorney. I'll let Kate introduce Jeremy shortly, but as most of you know, at Interfor, our investigative work frequently involves collecting human intelligence and working with sources and field personnel around the world. The art behind all of this is often shrouded in mystery. We hope to reveal some of that today. So in addition to heading up IA, Jeremy assists Interfor in this area, and he has shared some of the ways we go about this work in his new book, Sell Like a Spy. Today is a very rare opportunity to get behind the scenes on some of the investigative work that Interfor does for our clients as Kate talks through the aspects of the book. I'm sure it's going to be a great conversation. We'll leave time at the end for some questions, so please put your questions in the chat and we'll be sure to get to them. So I'll turn it over to Kate from here on in.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for having me on the webinar. I'm super excited today to interview Jeremy about Sell Like a Spy. I am a giant bookworm and a dork and a fan of all things spy, so this is a real treat for me. So Jeremy, obviously you wrote Sell Like a Spy. You started your career overseas, spending a decade abroad as a journalist based out of Prague and Shanghai. Since returning to the US, Jeremy has worked in the corporate security industry, and his clients have included some of the best-known companies in the world. He continues to write regularly as a regular columnist for The Hill, and recent contributions to Fast Company, USA Today, Forbes, and elsewhere. Jeremy is a strategic advisor to the corporate intelligence firm Interfor International and the head of Interfor Academy. And he's also a policy advisor on national security for the Joseph Rainey Center for Public Policy. So Jeremy, let's talk about spies.
It's great to be with you, Kate.
A lot of misconceptions about being a spy. You know, I love Fauda. I watch it all the time. But that's not real life as I understand it, and as I understand from your book. How are spies a misunderstood group of people? Can you talk a little bit about that and perhaps describe generally what the book is about and how you came to write it?
Absolutely. I think the misconceptions about spies is always the best first place to start with this kind of conversation about the book and how to leverage spy tradecraft into business communication and everyday life, because I also love spy TV shows and movies, and occasionally they get some things that seem really right, but they glamorize the spy world. You know, it's very far from the James Bond world of, you know, driving an Aston Martin and being involved in gun chases and gunfights and seduction and all of that, or Jason Bourne with almost superhuman kind of skills. These are everyday individuals that, of course, the CIA screens for certain analytical skills and personality skills, but they are trained to leverage behavioral science and leverage emotional intelligence to connect very deeply with their targets. They're not coercing people. They're not blackmailing people, contrary to what you see in these shows. They're connecting very deeply. And I think we're going to get into that a little bit more. So I think it's important to level set that these are human beings like the rest of us so that we can learn from them. So that's, you know, some of the key misconceptions. One other quick one, and I think I disappoint a lot of people with this, is, you know, there's a joke that spies are medium everything, medium height, medium stature, because I always ask people, if you're a spy at a diplomatic event, doesn't it make more sense to be someone who's a little bit more average looking that could kind of materialize from a crowd, ask a few questions, and then disappear versus some sort of heartthrob that, you know, no one could forget or take their eyes off of? So, you know, I joke around that you're more likely to find a spy who looks like a frumpy academic than someone who resembles Daniel Craig. But, you know, and I think I disappoint a lot of people there. As for the book, very quickly, despite the title Sell Like a Spy, it's actually more of a synthesis beyond just the skills of CIA case officers of elite government officials. And in this field of corporate security, I've worked with FBI hostage negotiators, military interrogators, special forces, members of the Secret Service. And observing and working directly with these people, I have synthesized many of the lessons that I have picked up and used in my own life and business career to bring them to all of you, to readers and to audiences that I speak to and train. And there are some incredible things that we can use from this world, and it's seasoned with a lot of anecdotes in there too to make it practical. And maybe we'll get into a couple of those.
So you say that spies are the best salespeople. Why is that?
Yeah, I do. And the idea is that because I believe there's no harder sale that anybody could make than to convince someone to buy into treason. And, that's the hardest sale to possibly make. And that's where we can start to learn from people. Kind of the concept of connection is something I spend a lot of time on, and how spies leverage what's known as radical empathy to connect with their targets. Because I always say to people, you meet somebody, and then you sometimes say you hit it off. You meet somebody and you get along right away. But other times you meet somebody, they might not be that into you, you might not be that into them, but you still want to connect and influence that person. And that's where spies are so good at doing what they do, because spies don't necessarily connect with, as part of their job, people they would choose to be friends with. They have to recruit criminals and diplomats from some really bad places, terrorists. And these skills of radical empathy, intellectual curiosity, making yourself vulnerable, that I expand on in the book and we can chat about further, are ways to do that.
You actually give a good example of that in the book when you yourself went to interview the Malaysian head of state who had made a lot of anti-Israel, anti-Semitic comments, and you had to put your personal feelings sort of aside in order to do that interview. And I found that fascinating.
Yeah, thank you, Mahathir bin Mohammed. It was a hard interview to get. He was a, historic figure in Southeast Asia, a lot of things to admire about his life, but many things to not admire. And I think it's not only a lesson about connection, but it's also a lesson of navigating the business world, or any aspect of our modern world right now in our polarized time, making sure that you're focused on your mission, you're focused on what you're there for, and you don't get dragged into having a political conversation with somebody you're trying to cultivate in a business sense where you might not be on the same page. So I think there's an important contemporary lesson in that.
Now, what are some of the other key skills involved in the spy tradecraft that can help connect and influence others in their careers and everyday lives? For those of us that aren't in the espionage world, what lessons can we garner from it?
Yeah, I'll expand on something I just talked about, which when it comes to connection, making yourself vulnerable is something that is a great thing to do. And I share a lesson in the book about a personal experience, something that I've overcome in my life that winds up coming up tactically a lot. I'm deaf in my right ear, and I describe how that came about and the practical ways that it winds up drawing people closer to me. Because what I write about is when I share this, when it comes up, someone who might have been treating me with a sense of distance, all of a sudden pulls closer to me when I've shared something like that. And I think you'll find that happens all the time, because spies leverage behavioral science. There are things that we do as human beings, and they happen almost every time. So if I share something about myself in this way, something that makes me vulnerable, almost always the person on the other side tends to respond in kind. People tend to share something intimate about themselves or a loved one, and it humanizes yourself. And I have an example in the book about a spy. Some I can name in the book, some I can't. In this case, I don't name the individual, but he talks about during his postings overseas how he has a son, I believe, on the autism spectrum, and how he would share that with people occasionally, and it would almost always lead to closer relationships as people shared about their family. So that's an important aspect of tradecraft. We were just getting into, I think, aspects of elicitation. I was referencing a little bit, and that is one of the most popular things I talk about, which is kind of a more circumspect way to collect information. Because I always say, whether you're a spy, a salesperson, or a journalist, when you meet someone of interest, you want to try to learn all about that person. But if you start peppering that person with a ton of questions, sometimes really on the nose questions, you might get the opposite response you're going for: cynicism, suspicion, what have you. And so elicitation gives us a little bit of a different chance to collect information. And I'll just give you an example. So if, Kate, say you had a big surprise party coming up, a big birthday coming up, and we wanted to throw you a surprise party, all your friends, but we forgot your favorite food and we wanted to have that on hand, I might call you up and say something like, Kate, isn't Thai food your favorite? Do you want to go hit this new Thai restaurant I heard about in my neighborhood? And you would say, Thai's great. It's not my favorite. I don't know where you got that from. Pizza is actually my favorite. because the tendency to correct
Jeremy, if
is
you
really
want to
strong.
throw me a surprise party, shawarma is my favorite.
Warma, see, good to know. And you just did what you proved my point. There is a
Exactly.
tendency.
You just used your trick on me, right?
Exactly. There's a tendency to correct among people. So we're all vain. We're all kind of the stars of our own little story, as I describe it. And no human being, or it would be strange if you didn't correct the record about yourself. So that's a little bit of a glimpse. There's many ways to elicit information. I think you might be asking a little bit more about that, and we can get into it.
Well, you talked a lot about that in the book about pushing human buttons to get the responses that we want. And there was a very interesting section about listening and how people often don't listen. They're just waiting for you to finish talking so they can talk about themselves.
Yes.
But I guess spies are doing the opposite. They're actually garnering that information to respond the way that they need to, correct?
That is correct. And I describe active listening as the most important skill, whether you're, again, a spy, a salesperson, what have you. I think active listening is the most important human skill when it comes to connecting very deeply. Because, I ask audiences all the time and I pause after I ask it. I say, what can you envision in your head the greatest listener you've ever experienced? And I wait for a moment and people are nodding. And I say, you always have a high opinion of that person, right? And it's true because when we are listened to, we feel respected, we feel seen. So it's a really challenging thing to do. And I'll talk for a moment about why that is, but it is the easiest way to build respect with somebody and also to use their name in the conversation. And you're absolutely right. People tend to listen with an intention to reply, not an intention to understand. And there are evolutionary challenges related to that. We listen, we're able to comprehend much faster than we're able to speak. And that's an easy thing to understand when you think about how you've been talking to somebody and sometimes they seem impatient and they often finish your sentence for you because they know where you're going. They want you to wrap up so they could give you their interesting reply and anecdote, right? So you see that. We have a tendency to listen with the gist of things. And we also listen with a strange way, actually, of doing it. Some people say up to 90% of our comprehension of a conversation is body language and tone of voice. Now, that's a controversial number. It varies widely, I think, in circumstances and people. But it is definitely true that we listen more with body language and tone of voice than we do with the words. So I talk to people about these kind of things because I want people to understand the challenges around active listening, and I want them to commit to an active listening practice and growing that practice over time. As I describe it, there's no button you can push to turn you into an elite active listener, no trick I could teach you. But there are other ways. I have a section where I talk about embodying Bill Clinton because of his unique listening skills. And there's a section in the book called Spies in Disguise, which helps us aspire to certain character archetypes and take on some of those qualities. And Bill Clinton is a great one for active listening. But that is one of the most important skill to have and a very challenging one to cultivate.
I think as a lawyer, that's super important. I know we have a lot of attorneys on the call as well. And, for us, we're rushing client to client. There's a lot of work, there's phone calls, but sometimes to get the client, to get them to trust you, to get them to want to work with you, you have to listen to them. You have to be able to, really allow them. I mean, as an immigration lawyer, I deal with people that are moving, that are relocating.
Right.
They need people right away. And it's a very stressful process and they want to be heard. And I have to force myself, to give them the time that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's a section in the book where one of the spies I talk with is a very gregarious, outgoing person. And he had to really train himself because he was based frequently in the Middle East and he would have to meet with an agent in a very short setting to collect the information and, to not be distracted, to not talk about other things, to focus on letting that person speak a lot. And if you just let people speak, getting back to elicitation, they will share more than they intended to. If you ask a clarification question, if you're making steady eye contact, your body language is calm, you will learn more about that person than you probably would if you started asking them a million questions.
So beyond the specific tradecraft you've been describing, there's some fun sections in the book where you transfer some of the philosophies of spies to everyday life. So you talk about go to where the clients are, crawl, walk, run. And there's even a section on atmosphere and intangibles. So can you explain to our audience today what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you the quick description of the first, and then I'll focus a little bit more on that last one, the atmosphere and intangibles. Go to where the clients are is a fun one. Real quick, the anecdote, Bob Grenier, who wrote the forward to the book, who's a member of Interfor Academy and was the former head of the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA, recounts how his first posting was in North Africa. He still won't say exactly where it was, but he was tasked with infiltrating the burgeoning communist student youth movement at the local university. And in order to do so, he had to figure out how to meet these people on their own terms, right? So he found out that his clients, if you will, these students were hitchhiking all around town. So he got himself a beat up sedan and he started picking up hitchhikers to go to where the clients are. And he met people that helped him recruit the right agents and get to know them. I recount a slightly less dangerous situation in my career where I went to where the clients are to meet some well-heeled financial services clients. And we relate to how you might do that by, understanding which clients are focused on a certain charity, or many other ways that we can try to get to know people in our professional sphere outside of the business world where we might have certain armor up or other things. So ways to use those things are fun too. Crawl, walk, run is kind of a sales blueprint to go after that big whale of a client, the longer term consultative sale that takes time, which very much mirrors the spy recruitment process. If you compare the sales cycle of, the spy world and the business world, it's definitely more of that kind of long tail, deeper consultative sale. So that section offers a little bit more insight in how to think about and be patient to, which doesn't come naturally to me as a New Yorker in recruiting that client. And then finally, you asked about the atmosphere and intangibles. That is something I'm really passionate about. And I believe that the atmosphere of a client office, their culture, and of course, the individuals who make it up and define the culture should really impact our sales process. And spies certainly use all of these details and internalize them as they're going through recruitment. And real quick, as an example, if you walk into an office and the lobby is very Spartan, there's very little artwork, it's not particularly well decorated. You look inside the rest of the office and it's a cubicle farm without much character. What that says to me is that a value sell is going to be the way to go. I think that client is probably going to be a little bit more thrifty. You're going to want to talk about the value of your product or service there as you shape your pitch. Conversely, I've spent a lot of time working with hedge funds. Kate, we're both here in New York. If you're looking at a view similar to what's in our background right now, you walk into a lobby of a big hedge fund and there's, beautiful abstract art, all over, gorgeous furniture. That doesn't scream out value sell. That screams out premium sell. And, that means they want the best of the best. That's what the culture is telling you. And there are other examples of individuals and how, if you walk into a client and they sit down and they're very conservatively dressed and they get down to business right away, that's different than if you sit down with a client, a mixed group of men and women of different ages. There are pictures on the wall of team building exercises, laughs, trophies. Very different approach. And we naturally, as people, pivot to those things. But being conscious, and I talk about bringing the subconscious to the conscious as a way to improve your salesmanship, as spies do in this respect, of those atmosphere and intangibles can lead to better rapport building, a better assessment of where the client is. Salespeople tend to get in love with their own voice. They tend to think that they have a great product or service and they're really charming and that everything should fall in line there. But spies know that these intangibles, these other details can often influence the recruitment and whether it happens or not. And I could launch into that book cover thing that you and I have chatted about, but I'll wait for your cue if you want to talk about that or not. I know you've found it to be of interest in the past.
Yeah. It's interesting too, in what you're saying is you can start the meeting one way and then completely miss cues. And even in the meeting, you may have people that have mixed cues, and you talk about that a little bit in the book. You might have a senior guy who's completely in his iPhone, not paying attention,
Right.
but the younger person who actually gets to make decisions and has authority over the budget is being responsive more to, wherever you're taking the meeting. So even within that sort of space, knowing the difference and how to read people differently, even in those surroundings, is also very important.
Absolutely correct. I mean, again, another thing that salespeople do is just fall in love with power, and they think that the managing director is going to be the one making the decision no matter what. But not reading the cue in the room and understanding that the MD is just there for backup or whatever. Maybe they're having a really busy day. It's the principal just below that person that is actually going to be deciding which vendor to use on this particular project. So you don't want to just fall in love with power. You want to read the room. You want to understand the dynamic of the people at the table, watch their body language and how they're interacting, and note all those things and adjust accordingly.
So besides spies, you've also worked with other types of professionals, not just in intelligence, but in the military. You've worked in security and have dealt with kidnap for ransom negotiation. And there's a whole section in the book about this. So what can we, regular people learn from kidnap for ransom situations, and how do we apply that in our daily life?
What can we learn? So much, Kate. There's so much cool stuff to learn. We did a webinar, which folks watching this can find on the archive page of the Interfor Academy site, where we talked with Steve Romano, who I worked closely with. He's a former chief hostage negotiator at the FBI. So a lot more time spent on there on what's known as skills of social influence. But there are so many extraordinary things that these people can bring to day-to-day life. And it was such a pleasure to, work with these guys and write about it. I mean, where to start? I think that when they arrive on the scene to deal with a hostage siege, they're often dealing with people who are irrational, irate. Maybe they committed violence. They can be very upset. And one of the most practical skills of an FBI hostage negotiator that anybody listening to this can then go use on a client, on their teenage child, on their spouse, whatever it is. If someone is upset and they are talking fast and they are talking loud, you will not do anybody any good by meeting them where they are, by talking fast and talking loud. If you're in a dramatic situation and someone is upset, the best thing you can do is speak calmly and slowly, because people are influenced by the social atmosphere around them. And if you continue to insist on speaking in a slow and deliberate manner, they will eventually conform to the social norm that you are establishing. And you can see this in interactions, with a group that might be very animated and worked up about something. They'll all be gesturing and, joking around. If you see somebody engaged in a more sober discussion, kind of stroking their chin, other people take those cues. So we are intensely social animals that look around about how to behave based on the others. And a spy, an FBI agent, and others know this about behavioral science, and they know that they can influence the people around them by doing that. So that's one of the aspects about how they do things. FBI hostage negotiators oftentimes look at this negotiation and try to think, is this an expressive situation? Does the individual who is taking people hostage, what is their motivation here? It might be, my spouse is leaving me, I'm upset. My boss fired me and I'm upset. They want someone to talk to. They want to be understood, right? It could be instrumental. I'm trying to free my brethren from jail. I want a helicopter and $10 million. There's a very specific goal in that. When you approach a negotiation as a business person, understanding, is this expressive or instrumental, is a really good way to think about it, right? Is this a private equity deal where the owner is an older gentleman who has made all his money, but now he wants to leave the firm in good standing? That's an expressive negotiation, right? If it's instrumental, that person is trying to say, I want to get the most amount of money I can possibly get. That's the goal. So stepping back and identifying situations and trying to put that kind of label on them so that you can find the best path forward is another example about how we can learn from FBI hostage negotiators.
I think that's very useful, especially when you're in a situation where a client may be upset or anything like that. Maintaining calm is very important. Now, I know you do training sessions on emotional intelligence for junior teams, and this is a topic that you address a lot. Can you talk a little bit about that?
About
emotional intelligence, how you support the development of emotional intelligence.
Absolutely. That is something that's coming up a ton, and often with law firms these days.
Post-pandemic, with the rise of remote work.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been a challenge in getting, somebody right out of college, to move from that kind of college atmosphere into a more professional environment. And I think there's never been a greater challenge with that than right now. Part of that is the ubiquity of screens. People I don't think are as emotionally intelligent as they were before cell phones, because we miss cues because we're looking at our phones or our computers, right? So there's that element. And then there's, as you noted, the pandemic and the fact that people didn't finish school with a lot of socializing. And now this world of not going to the office all the time, which works better for some than others, I think is also influencing emotional development. And I feel for the younger generation. It works out well for me, but I feel for the younger generation because, water cooler chatter, that impromptu happy hour, that, meeting with someone 15, 20 or more years, your senior in an office talking about your life and career, those were incredibly valuable moments in my life. So, I think that Sell Like a Spy has something to add in kind of filling that void and getting people to be more conscious of body language, of getting them to be more conscious of how they connect in different ways to do it. Again, making yourself vulnerable, demonstrating intellectual curiosity, mirroring behaviors, active listening. You can train people, just as the CIA does, to improve in these areas. And firms are really interested in doing this for their young people, which I think is really great and really important. And young people are really receptive to these ideas too. And people are typically pretty receptive about trying to bring spy skills into their life. They think it's cool, but you're touching on, I think, one of the most important business issues of the day. How are we going to take this new generation of leaders for tomorrow and help make sure that they have the same kind of emotional tools that have been available to us in our careers?
And I definitely think, there's a huge difference between the four generations, which are now in the workforce. We have the boomers and Gen X, then you have millennials, and then you have this Gen Z that has essentially come up during this pandemic and this remote work and Zoom. And one of the questions we actually have from the audience is, when we go to many meetings, including this one, what are tips for active listening on Zoom? Because I think many of us are multitasking, doing a lot of things, and we have a tendency to space out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this question always brings me back to a question as I was, in the interviewing process and thinking through my philosophies about this. And I spoke with a female case officer I worked closely with, really terrific, intelligent person who helped manage nuclear non-proliferation issues in Central Europe. And I posed this question to her because, as I think I noted earlier, a lot of my career has been longer term consultative sales. And I wanted to talk with her about a quicker sale, someone who might do door-to-door sales or is kind of, just something that's a quicker, shorter tail. And she said, Jeremy, if I had 45 minutes in a room with an Iranian diplomat in Vienna, I would use the same skills and same playbooks that I would use if I had, a much more expanded period of time. So it means if you're on Zoom, the same kind of skills that I write about in the book and that we've talked about here of active listening apply. Make sure you're focused on that person, you're making good eye contact, and your body language is steady. Make sure you're listening with an intention to understand and not an intention to reply. Put aside that witty reply or anecdote that you have and keep it there, but ask a clarification question and encourage that person to talk and use their name. There's no sweeter sound to us than our own name, and we feel respected and seen when we hear their name. If you see somebody leaning forward on the Zoom and kind of leaning in, mirror that behavior. If they're leaning back and they're, taking a sip of water occasionally, try to mirror the behavior of the person in front of you, not so overt that, you run the risk of, looking ridiculous. And I write about how important it is to practice mirroring behaviors, but use all the same skills that I'm talking about in person, but bring them to that Zoom world as well. They're still applicable there.
So you talk in the book about mirroring, understanding body language and cues. And you actually say how many people's first impression is the correct one, although you should still continue to gather information. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Reading body language. That's the idea here. Well, one of the things that you want to do, and by the way, I recommend picking up a book by one of the people who's featured in mine, Joe Navarro from the FBI. He's the expert on body language. But there's a section on there, and it's something I talk about regularly. And one of the first things I talk about is establishing a baseline. So if you're sitting in a conference room with somebody, try to ask yourself, what is this person like physically? Are they speaking a lot with their hands? Do they seem very calm? Are they blinking a lot? All of these things are important. Try to establish a bit of a baseline in your head about this person, because what you want to do from there is watch when they deviate from that baseline. If you bring up price and they start rubbing the back of their neck, that's a soothing gesture. Familiarize yourself with what looks like a soothing gesture. And you'll see they rub their legs, they lick their lips or something when you bring up, deadline, when you bring up pricing. These deviations from the baseline can indicate anxiety and many other things. So there are ways to read body language. Another good tip is if you're at a business networking event or a conference, what have you, or you're just in a room and you're sitting with somebody, if their feet are pointed at the door and they're not pointed at you, if you're standing and talking to somebody and their body is angled away from you, they are not interested or they're not committed to the conversation. They're looking to exit the conversation. So you should be thinking about that too. Your body language when you're talking to somebody should be firmly focused and your body should be focused towards that person. The feet can actually be a very telling thing when it comes to body language. So look down at someone's feet when you're standing and talking with them at that networking event. If it's pointed towards the bar, they want you to stop telling your long-winded story and they want to go get a drink. So that is one way to think about it. Was there something else beyond body language? Was it mirroring as well?
Mirroring and first impressions. You talk a
Yeah,
lot about how first impressions
right.
are something that initially your gut is correct on, which I found
Yes,
very interesting and counterintuitive.
definitely. Let me talk about that and then I'll briefly touch on mirroring. One of the things I like to say is that the old cliche that you can't judge a book by its cover is not true. You can judge a book by its cover. I have some caveats, but behavioral science shows us that we form impressions of people in less than a second many times, and they are largely correct in many cases, right? So you should be trusting your instincts on who and how to approach somebody. How we portray ourselves to the world is an advertisement to how we want people to see us. And there's information there that the spy or salesperson can use. Is it, facial hair or lack thereof, glasses or no glasses, hairstyle, jewelry, the type of clothing that they wear, how they carry themselves. There's all information there, and you should be trusting your instincts about how to use that information and who you might hit it off with and how you might approach them. The key thing is to understand that people are extremely complex, okay? And the person you might think is kind of a square, you might start talking to and find that they are a wildly eccentric and interesting person, and you can't be wed to those judgments. One of my favorite quotes is that famous Walt Whitman quote, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." We all contain multitudes, so we need to remember that, but trust your instincts when you're networking, when you're making those first impressions, and use that to give yourself an advantage. And finally, on mirroring, a lot of people in the business world know mirroring. It's the physical replication of someone's, behavior in front of you. We use mirroring all our lives. When we're infants, we mirror the behavior of adults around us to learn how to behave like a human being. Someone smiles at you, you smile back kind of automatically. We all know that you yawn, it can create a, mass contagion of yawning. And that's human empathy at work. And it powers the effectiveness of mirroring. So if you mirror someone's behavior, if your client is leaning forward, as I noted, even if you're on Zoom, you want to be leaning forward as well. If your client is more relaxed, you might want to adopt a relaxed posture. And then I get into verbal mirroring, which is an FBI hostage negotiator skill, and I call it the varsity level of mirroring. Because think about the hostage siege, right? The hostage negotiator is not going to be able to physically mirror that person as they're trying to build rapport in a very short time frame. So they use many of the same words that they're getting back from that person. And then they look for colloquialisms and pet words that they can use. We all have these turns of phrase that we're really fond of saying, little slang that we use. Look for those things because it will implant in someone's head, hey, that person is on the same page as me. The company you're talking to might have a certain way of talking about their business or a phrase, like put a pin in it that you keep hearing from them. Use those phrases as well to mirror behavior. And just one other quick caveat about mirroring, that is the skill to practice the most before bringing it into your career. If it's done badly, it can really backfire. It can look like you're mocking someone or copying them. So practice your mirroring chops on your friends and family where you won't get in trouble if you do it badly.
That's good advice. We have a question from the audience asking you to expand a little bit on this concept of radical empathy.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Radical empathy is sometimes called tactical empathy as well. And I mentioned that spies have to recruit, from the likes of criminals, terrorists, diplomats from some of the most odious regimes in the world. And they do that. They use radical empathy to find that kernel of humanity that is there in just about any person. You know, I describe it as the criminal that is actually a devoted family man, or the terrorist that practices acts of charitable good. The CIA trains its case officers to locate these kernels of humanity and focus on them. I also really like the quote attributed to Abraham Lincoln, who supposedly said, "I don't like that person. I must get to know him better." So you take it as a challenge to find that way to be empathetic towards people. And look, Kate, you and I are both in New York. We both have been involved in the legal world. You know, I've done a lot of work in finance. There are some really healthy egos. There are some people that can be difficult to work with. So I've been able to practice these skills. And you know, it also gets into what the FBI teaches. And Gary Nessner, one of the FBI hostage negotiators in the book, talks about it doesn't matter about being correct. You want to get your way, not win every time. And he talks about how likability is really important. And as a hostage negotiator, someone would say, "Hey, Gary, you're a real jerk," you know that? And he said, "Well, you know, I get that sometimes, but why don't you tell me what's bothering you?" You know, and trying to be, as he would note, kind of a, how did he describe it? A duck with the water flowing off his back. When you've identified somebody that has these flaws and you still want to try to influence them, try to avoid taking offense and try to locate that kernel of humanity, to use that radical empathy to form that real connection. And I'll finish this answer by sharing my favorite spy quote in the book. I talk about quotes from former intelligence professionals that can illuminate a concept. And that same female case officer in Central Europe said to me that every good intelligence officer has a real bond with their target on some level and in some regard. So these are very real relationships that they form with sometimes really bad people. So it can be done. And one of the pathways to do it is by effective use of radical empathy.
So another question for us novices practicing these techniques, perhaps we go to a meeting and somebody in the audience wants to know, what if we miss certain cues and the deal doesn't close? How do we turn it around last minute? Or should we just accept it for now and then regroup and try to come back? How do you know when to sort of push and try to salvage the situation?
That's a tough one, and I don't think there's any one quick answer. The opening of my book, the foreword I referenced, was written by Bob Grenier, who talks about a sale that was almost made. He thought he closed the deal, and then it didn't happen, and it would have changed history and avoided the war in Afghanistan if it had happened. So we're obviously not playing with stakes so high. So while every, you know, good salesperson kind of lives and dies with their quota, and I've been there, you know, and it can feel like the end of the world if a sale is falling apart. But I would urge anybody dealing with this to do a little bit of a calculation and say, will any more pushing help here? You know, if is there any way to change the deal? You know, try everything, think through everything, you know, whether changing the price, whether changing the deliverable time, you know, anything that could potentially help. I'd leave no stone unturned, though you don't want to seem desperate. And I think you want to just live to fight another day and think about the relationship long term. And I think it can be hard for salespeople who are often motivated by quarterly sales quotas. And I know I butted heads with a lot of heads of sales and others because I got really burnt out on quotas, and I have mixed feelings about them, tending towards the negative. I'm more of a long-term relationship guy, and I want to make sure that I don't burn bridges or estrange somebody in pushing so hard to close the deal that I won't feel good about calling that person in 3 to 6 months or something.
So then another question we have that I think makes a good follow-up to this from the audience is, we're hesitant to try these techniques that you're talking about because we don't have experience in them. So what advice can you give, you know, if we think they're too complex or outside the norm? What's a good starting point?
Well, using them on your friends and family. One of the first things in my talks, as I mentioned, is talking about misconceptions. And then actually, even as I introduce the concept of sell like a spy, the next thing I do is talk about how these are skills for everyday life. And everything I write about in the book and have talked about here, you should use in your everyday life for 2 important reasons. Number one, if you use them in your everyday life, you will practice these skills and you'll make them your own. And that's really important because if you're a person who does speak with a lot of body language and that's who you are, when you're mirroring behavior, you don't want to become an entirely different person. You want to keep your own brand, develop your own brand of how to use these skills. And you'll do that by practicing them with friends and family. So I pointed out with mirroring, if you're, mirroring your friend and they go, what the heck are you doing? That won't have as much negative input as if you do it with a client who thinks that you're making fun of them. So practice these things in your everyday life, because it'll help in your career, but it will also help you as you improve in these ways to grow relationships. I'm sure all of your friends will appreciate if you become a better active listener. They will enjoy your company more. You will become more socially successful if you do some of the things I've talked about here. You'll become a better parent if you learn how to diffuse emotional encounters, read body language, all of these things. So use them in your everyday life, practice them, and you'll find that once they're a little bit more second nature, they can really help you in your career.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about how to make an approach. In the book, you give the example of a spy sometimes has 5 minutes to meet someone in an alley, make the approach, and try to recruit them. And you contrast that with the famous Israeli spy, Eli Cohen, who infiltrated the creme de la creme of Syrian society and, met with Hafez al-Assad and Mohammed bin Laden and gave critical intelligence to Israel. That took years.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you know how much time to spend? How do you make this approach? And how long do you nurture a relationship?
Yeah, I'm going to reference something I said earlier, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of a wrinkle of strategy on how to develop that longer term. I mentioned earlier, asking a former colleague, a former spy that I worked with about, the more abbreviated sales cycle and what that was like. And again, I just want to reinforce, use all, the same skills I'm talking about here, the mirroring, the listening, the elicitation, the radical empathy. Even if you have a short window of time, these are all tools in your toolkit, and they should be used whether it's a years-long development process or a short-term one. What I can add on the longer-term one is the concept of access agents, okay? Working with a big client who calls them coaches. They're different companies have different forms of this. But the idea of the access agent is recruiting someone to help you get to the ultimate person that you want to recruit and has that intelligence for you, right? So in the book, there's a fun story, you might remember, Kate, about John Cipher, who I can name, who's a really interesting guy, a former case officer in the Soviet Union, and he had recruited an access agent, someone who hosted dinner parties and in Russia during the Soviet Union's time in Moscow, I believe. And he would give John the key to his cloakroom, and he would allow John to therefore go through the coats of diplomats and others and copy keys and gather intelligence. So that was a classic access agent example. Now, I'm not encouraging anybody to start going through codes and copying keys or anything like that. But what I am encouraging, if you're at like a networking event and you see what I call the silver fox, like the guy that is in the corner, the woman in the middle of the room that everybody's trying to get to because they're influential. A good spy and a good salesperson knows that it's harder to close a deal in a group than it is one-on-one. So you maybe slip the card to that person. Maybe you can get something going in the future. But really, the savvy thing to do is, who's that one person that keeps getting in and out of the conversation with the silver fox that seems to know that person well? Target them on the sidelines, cultivate them, get to know them a little bit, and see if they'll provide the warm introduction to that key person you're looking to cultivate. Because any salesperson knows that you have to do cold outreach, but the warm introduction is the holy grail. So I find that salespeople are sometimes reluctant to take that extra step because they want the short-term win. But, especially, at big law firms like yours, Kate, getting that relationship, thinking strategically and long-term about who it is you want to cultivate, who knows that person that can open that door to you and get you in that room, is a smart way to think about the cycle of recruitment, to kind of bring it back to your question.
Now, a follow-up to that is, in the book, you talk a lot about teams and diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And, those are buzzwords that are very hot right now across different types of industries. And you give a lot of strategies that spies use, so when does it not make sense to approach someone individually? When does it make sense to go as a couple, to go as a team? Yeah. When do you bring, women? When do you bring minorities or people from other cultures along? For me as an immigration lawyer, that's something that's very relevant. When I walk into do a pitch and my team looks like the clients we're about to represent, I know that resonates. But how does that work in sales?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm glad that you're referencing that, because I find that area in the book about diversity is something I'm proud of, and I want to get people to think a little bit differently about diversity, because I believe in the concept, and I think it's important that corporate America gets away from just thinking about it as metrics and pleasant faces on social media. And this is where we can learn a lot from how the government does it, and they take what's known as kind of the best athlete approach. And literally, I have a story in the book about one of the spies named Mark Polymeropoulos, who had a team, and he was doing a team building exercise where he would ask everybody to say something about themselves. And it turns out, making a long story short here, he had a very well-known college soccer player, a star on his team, and he had a diplomat in this Middle East posting who he knew was focused on collegiate soccer. It was really crazy about it. So he used the fact that he had this young woman on the team to create a diplomatic soccer match, and it led to the recruit of this diplomat because he was so impressed with that person. That's an example of diversity as far as I'm concerned. Having a diverse team, not the team that looked exactly like Mark, a white guy who is, lifts heavy weights and is kind of looks like a soldier. He has a diverse team that he could leverage and use a best athlete approach. Many people who know how diversity works, I have Matthew Horace in the book. We often reference something from him, and he talks about how if you're sitting at a table and you have a diverse group of people around the table, and the government knows this and they do this, you will have a better sense of, somebody might be offended by a certain thing, and you don't even think about that because you have your own set of experiences to draw from. So, and it's also referencing what you said about walking in with a diverse team signals something to a client, because we all have an inherent bias, right? In the same way that we're the stars of our own universe, we all have an inherent bias, and we're biased towards people who look and seem like us and come from similar backgrounds, because it goes back to that concept of mirroring. It offers us comfort. This person seems similar to me. They're acting in a similar way. They look in a similar way. So overcoming your inherent bias when you're hiring or staffing a team, and understanding that diversity offers different thoughts, that best athlete approach will give you different viewpoints and showcase other skills to clients, is a really important way to think about it. So broaden the scope of what diversity means, and it will help you.
Now we have a bunch of questions, so we are going to go till 1 o'clock, and I hope that's okay with the audience. And before we turn to the questions, I have a follow-up to what you just said. How does, in the book you describe a lot, not just how the intelligence community manages and leads teams, but how the military does and other branches of government. So can you talk about what lessons we can learn about that? And, you highlight, for example, in Afghanistan, the military had to bring together different factions. They had to not just go in with a strong hand, but really garner and develop trust.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much for that question in particular. There's that section involves a guy named General John Mulholland, who was head of the Special Forces when 9/11 happened, and real patriot, really cool guy. And he talks about listening to your team, right? And I think that's another blind spot oftentimes in corporate America. I think, C-suite level people, or even just heads of teams, can act with a little bit of hubris. They think they know better than the team that's down in the trenches often and speaking to clients. And the example in the book with John is about how during the chaotic months after 9/11, the U.S. wanted to get its hands on a particular leader who was affiliated with the Taliban, and they demanded that the team apprehend him. Well, the team let John know that, hey, if we take this guy in, we're going to be in a massive battle that'll make the Black Hawk Down Somalia situation look like a cakewalk. So let us think on another way. And John empowered him to do that. And it turned out this individual had some health challenges, and he was actually open to getting treated by the U.S. So the U.S. was able to airlift this guy to an aircraft carrier, get him, top level care, and they were able to ask him questions in a way that not like an interrogation room, and he was helpful to them, and they returned him to his people, and there was no bloodshed. And they did that. So John was able to listen to his team, and I think there's a real lesson for that in corporate leaders and corporate leadership. There's a section with General Stanley McChrystal, who I'm fortunate enough to have in the book, talks about how even as he was commander of Afghanistan, and this is such an amazing thing, where he had hundreds of thousands of people that he was literally the commander of, he said, I'm more of an influencer than commander. So I think his unique brand of leadership speaks to that you can order people to do something. That's one way to get them to do it. But if you influence them to want to do it themselves, it is a much more effective way of getting tasks carried out.
I think that's incredibly important. There was also another example in the book where you have to know when to turn away a client. And you gave an example from the corporate security world where a client wanted you guys to give security to go into Iraq, to Fallujah. You did an intelligence assessment and determined that it was a bad idea and tried to talk them into something else. They declined, went to Blackwater, and it was a debacle.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And it's in a section on ethics, which I'm also fond of talking about as well, because what good companies will do is make sure that their people understand the ethical framework of their company. And these days, it's very popular for a company to say, hey, we're green, or we value diversity, or, we're committed to, supporting the end of cancer. Like they have a lot of different companies have a lot of different missions that are added on socially to the bottom line of making money, right? And the CIA faced a challenge like that in the 90s. And Bob Grenier, I referenced earlier, was put in charge of the farm, and he was asked to provide an ethical framework. And the CIA has done that. It trains its case officers to understand that its first responsibility is to the Constitution. There's no license to kill. So you have to understand that the 007 stuff is nonsense. Making sure that the mission comes first, the safety of the agent, the reputation of the CIA. They want its case officers to understand in each case what the priorities are. So businesses understanding that with their team and for their clients is really important too. And yes, you're right. I was a part of a team, and we were asked to do the infamous Fallujah route, and our team on the ground said this is too dangerous and we need to do a more roundabout route. And the client refused, and they went with Blackwater, and it led to the 3 or 4 contractors being, brutally killed, and it led to a massive battle ultimately in Fallujah. Not that that would have not happened, but these lives could have been saved if they had listened again to their people on the ground, and if they had a better ethical framework. And we did, and we were able to talk about that with our clients. And I think it was important with the clients, but it was really important to me as an employee to know that in the dangerous work that we do in the corporate security world, sometimes there is an ethical compass behind what we do, and it informs every aspect of our work and our approach.
Actually, I also really loved in the book where you talked about piracy, where you were against advising a lot of these boats that were doing shipping from arming, their workers who could possibly get into a lethal situation if they attempted to, fire and fight off pirates.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have these guys that are sailors, and you're all of a sudden, there's clients wanted to give them M16s and have them shoot down pirates, which, is dubious from a skills perspective and is ethically unfair to these individuals. So we counseled them on non-lethal measures to, refute an attack, putting barbed wire on the hull when they're going through these pirate-infested waters, water cannons, high-powered acoustic devices. So these were effective many times in repelling people, and then you create a safe room, and that's what insurance is for if there's kidnapping. So there's a lot more I can say. We're obviously on a time constraint here, but another example of ethical leadership and thinking sometimes counterintuitively, working with a firm like Interfor to get good answers to challenging, vexing questions you might not have ever thought about.
So let's turn back to the audience questions. I want to make sure we get to all of them before we end. What advice would you give someone who is selling remotely and doesn't always get to meet their potential customers in person?
Yeah, I think we touched upon this with the Zoom question. It's still using those same skills. It's still making sure that you're active listening, mirroring, doing all those things. One of the things that we didn't get to yet is kind of creating a dossier and understanding the background of your client and really going deep. And that's something I train people on and advocate very strongly. I think if you don't have the ability to pick up those physical cues and go through some physical meeting with somebody, a meal, what have you, and you're only remote, it would be a good idea to know even more about that person, and try to find a way to build rapport in that way. If their LinkedIn page says they went to, a Big Ten college and you're a college basketball nut, maybe you want to reference that, see if that leads to something, So do your homework about that person, see if you could find a touch point to connect with, go the extra mile with your homework on that person.
Another very good question is, are there any variances for those who are naturally extroverts, type A's, compared with natural introverts who are forced into work networking situations?
Good question. I reference this often at the beginning of talks too, when I'm kind of talking about the world of intelligence. Because I like to tell people that are on the more introverted side of the spectrum that I've worked with super effective spies and salespeople that are on the more introverted side. And, never fear, you have skills. You often have more of an advantage in many ways than the gregarious, outgoing salesperson or spy, because if you're an extrovert, it's harder for you to turn it down than it is for an introvert to turn it up. That might be surprising for people to hear, but it's been shown. And I think you see that all the time when you have an extrovert who can't shut up, who can't listen with an intention to understand rather than just an intention to reply. If you're an introvert, you have a natural leg up on the ability to be a great active listener. So when you're going into a business networking event, and there's 100 people and you don't know anybody there, that'll make anybody kind of nervous and anxious. But if you're an introvert, take a little reassurance and calmness by knowing that all you need to do is, start talking to somebody, whether you ask a question or it's just an elicitation moment where you're trying to get them to respond in kind. Get that person talking, ask a clarification question, and just shut up. And you'll find that they're going to talk so much. And not only will you be considered a great active listener, they'll think you're a great conversationalist, even if you just did a lot of listening. So introverts are never fear. You often have a leg up in many ways.
What are your tips for uncovering pain points in consultative selling during the discovery process?
Elicitation and body language are the two that come to mind. So I would suggest when you're going into that conversation and you're looking for those pain points, have that in mind for what it is. And if you're reluctant to ask about price, make some sort of passing reference to the price of something else, and see how they respond to it. If they're like, those guys are really cheap, well, that means that maybe they're proud of not being cheap, So find a more oblique way to bring up the pain point that you're trying to learn about and see if it elicits a response. And then if you bring up that a certain pain point, the delivery time, a competitor, whatever the case may be, watch to see if they go with a soothing gesture or if they lean in even further. Watch what their body language will tell you about the response. Those are two quick thoughts on that question.
Another interesting question from the audience: how similar are actors and spies in adapting and being the person they need to be to accomplish their goals?
Very interesting. I wonder if some of the people have read my book, because I talk a little bit about that. How, I remember a quote about how an actor talked about how they really like saw themselves in the role and it becomes really natural. I have a whole section called Spies in Disguise. And, one of the few things Hollywood gets right about the spy world is that they use disguises, and they certainly use cover stories, right? So this is a world of acting in many ways. So there's some great parallels there. And in that workshop and in that section, Spies in Disguise, we talk about people who you admire in your life. And I reference Mad Men in the book because you have Don Draper, who's this, man with gravitas and charisma. And you have Roger Sterling, who's the silver fox I described. Everybody wants to know him. He's really popular. And I have both sides of those individuals in myself. And I will bring them out and put on a mask and act depending on who I'm talking to, right? And I describe that at length in the book as a method, because again, we're all like the Walt Whitman quote, we all have multitudes. And you should think about yourself as an actor sometimes in this business setting. And that's why I think people can draw inspiration from spies, because if you put yourself in the shoes of a spy going into a meeting, it's a funner challenge than going in as just a salesperson or a lawyer trying to close new business. So acting and spying, there's a lot of great parallels. I talk about it at length in the book.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. The last question I have before we wrap up is there's a section in the book where you said good spies are constantly re-recruiting their assets. They're constantly reaching out to them, they're meeting with them, and every time they meet with them, they are re-recruiting. And I think in the corporate world, that's also something that's very important, having constant touch points without overdoing it. So how do you find that happy medium?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's no one particular recipe there, but I think a lot of good salespeople will close that deal and move on, and that person then feels a little bit neglected. And you should really make an effort to check in on how the sale you made is being serviced, what's going on with that person, and keeping in touch. And people really appreciate it. And spies do this. They file contact reports after meeting with their agents, and that'll have intelligence not only on, what the actual intelligence they gathered is, but also on how's that individual doing? Do they have bags under their eyes? Are they gaining or losing weight? Did they report fighting with their spouse? Are they under suspicion at work? All of these details, and that references the atmosphere and intangibles, should be noted, and it should be put into your CRM system to create a mosaic of information that you'll be able to look back on over time to, form a opinion about the culture and where they're going. So yes, re-recruit your sales contact every time. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm gonna pass the baton over to Don over here, and just I really want to thank Kate for these great questions, and the audience as well. You've been a tremendous partner, and we really appreciate it.
Maybe before we pass it to Don, we could just tell everyone where to get their copy of Sell Like a Spy.
Thank you. What kind of author am I that I didn't remember what kind of salesperson am I that I didn't remember to hawk my own book? But yes, Sell Like a Spy is out. It's available on Amazon or wherever you get your books. There will be editions in Russian, Italian, and German for any people overseas. That's coming. There's an audiobook version out now. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you both. Kate, you beat me to the punch. I was going to plug the book. Jeremy, Kate, you guys did a great job. Very, very informative. Thank you so very much. Just a heads up, we're going to have another session next month. It's going to be about disinformation right in time for the upcoming election. So here in the US, it'll be an interesting dynamic, and Jeremy will have an interesting guest he will interview. Thanks again. And if you have any follow-up questions, reach out to us and we'll be sure to follow up.